It's about time that we revisit an old topic on this channel. About 2 years ago, I made the best starting lineup of all time for every OWL team to commemorate the end of Overwatch 1. Needless to say, since then, a lot has changed, making that video pretty outdated. The landscape has changed significantly, and now that OWL is over, a bunch of you have requested an updated version with Overwatch 2 in mind, and with time to finally process it all, I'm ready to take on the task. But this time we're doing things a little different. Instead of just doing a starting 5 with nothing else, this time there's a bench. Instead of focusing on just 5 specific players, why not make it the best team in overall rotation that we can? Don't get it twisted, we're not trying to make the most deep roster humanly possible in this video. We could always do that in an all-time 12-man roster vid later down the line, but for this one, we're trying to craft a rotation that makes sense using as many or as few players as needed. Aside from that, the principle is virtually the same. The goal is to form the best team we can using any and all players who played for a franchise regardless of logistics, so something like language barrier can be thrown right out the window. We're just looking at general performance, and these players will all be in their prime form when they played in the league, regardless of whether they peaked with this specific team or not. Oh, and this is only going to be considering their OWL careers, nothing before, nothing after, so just try and keep that in mind. Time to see where things go different compared to the last time, Atlanta Reign. I'm going with a Gatorhawk tank line, Pelican, Lip, and Stalker on damage, and then for support I'll go Fielder, Chio, and Iris, and I also think that we should put Masa on this team in spirit. While he wouldn't be playing just because of his relevance with this franchise and how long he's been there, he should be there to ride the bench and be a part of the experience. The roster as a whole though, I mean, it's looking pretty strong. The one glaring hole is probably tank. Gatorhawk is not special by any means, and maybe you'd want to put Donghack on here for dive reasons, but generally, Gator and Hawk have been the most successful tanks to wear an Atlanta Reign uniform, so I don't see why you wouldn't pick them. As for the other stuff though, I mean, they're looking good. Pelican, Lip, and Stalker is probably one of the strongest possible DPS lines you can make. We already know what Lip and Stalker can do. They're literally at the MVP level when they are at their best. We saw what they could do as a duo last year, and now you're adding Pelican into the mix as well, who in his prime on Atlanta Reign carried this team to a grand finals. There's a lot of versatility, a lot of star power. They cover everything you need, and they will dominate. And much can be said about the support line too. Fielder Chio need no introduction, that is one of the best backlines in the history of the Overwatch League. And then you have Iris there alongside them just for some extra flexibility. He's not really going to start, but there are situations where he could be useful, and in his prime on Atlanta in 2021, he was a damn good player. With Boston Uprising, I'm going with Smurf Punk for the tank line, Decay, Birdring, and Striker for damage. In support, rounding it out, Lee Jae Gon, Twilight, and Izayaki. We can get the easy stuff out of the way after. For now, we just have to address the elephant in the room. Why the heck do I have Punk on this team? Well, for starters, again, if we plugged this team into the Overwatch 1 era, you need another tank, but also, I think that Punk just deserves to be on this Boston roster. He's been a staple of their team for years, despite them trying to bench him at every possible corner. Even through all of that adversity, he's been a solid tank player, a carry for Boston. And while Smurf, you're confident he can play most tanks at a high level, for ultimate comfort, you can have Punk go in there for a D.Va, or a Zarya, or a Sigma. It makes sense, even though it would be kind of weird to have one random Australian with all of these Koreans. The other weird thing you might be looking at is Striker. I mean, with Decay and Birdring, do you really need him? In my opinion, I don't think it hurts to have him, but also, much like Punk, he has been a staple of Boston. What he did for Season 1 on that team was just absolutely incredible. His Tracer play at his peak might be the best ever. A lot of people do think it is the best ever, so I don't think it hurts to have him on here, even if he's not going to play that much. Striker's just a Boston legend for more than one reason. And the rest of the team, I mean, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Smurf might be the GOAT tank, in a lot of people's eyes he is. Then Decay, Birdring, at their peaks, absolutely insane players. Like, take Decay from last year, let's say, or during his early Dallas days. plus Birdring on his early London years or his first season on the Gladiators, and you've got a pretty nasty situation going on there. And to cover those guys, Lee Jae, Gone, Twilight, and Izayaki are three of the best to ever do it at their respective roles, so this Boston team is looking pretty clean. The Chengdu Hunters. Let's go with Gaga, Elsa, Among for tank, damage being Leave, Jinmu, and Jimmy, and then support Monk and Xerneas. This team is a little weird because, you know, 3 tanks at once. But I think it's necessary because, one, Among is a staple. Not having him on the Chengdu Hunters would be a crime. He is literally their spirit animal. But at the same time, you also need Gaga, who's just the better overall main tank compared to Among. He can play more things outside of that ball very effectively. So I feel like you kind of need both. Even if you're not going to play Among, he's got to be on the team. Generally, though, Chengdu are not the strongest on tank. Gaga, Elsa, and Among aren't super standout names in terms of dominance. All decent players, all fairly consistent, but nothing world-breaking. Where Chengdu's real strength comes in is, of course, at DPS, with peak Leave, MVP form Leave. That's their hard carry, the guy they're going to depend on, just like they did in real life. I also thought it was necessary to have Jinmu. He was on Chengdu literally right from the beginning, and for most of their existence. A reliable projectile throughout. Decent on Sombra, good far on Genji player. And then also, just for coverage reasons, I included Jimmy. Jimmy wasn't the best on Chengdu, but if you take him from his prime on Guangzhou and plug him into Chengdu, then I think you could do some good work alongside Leave in like a Tracer hit scan meta, let's say. And for the backline, I don't really think it's necessary to have 3 with Chengdu. You could if you want to. It doesn't hurt to maybe include Farway if you want, but I think Monk Xerneas is just fine. They showed how effective they could be during Chengdu's peak. They're one of the strong points of that team. Monk, just this year on Hangzhou Spark, showed some incredible peaks and showed that he can hang in there with even the best players in the world. And Xerneas has just had many solid years as a player, even showing he can play some of the flex support heroes fairly well. So I'm actually pretty confident in the Chengdu backline, and I think this team, while not amazing, is still pretty decent and pretty fun. Moving on to the Dallas Fuel, it's just necessary to go with that starting core from their 2022 championship, but I'm also adding Decay into the mix to give them some extra firepower at DPS. Some people forget that Decay once was a member of the Dallas Fuel, and even back then he was still a really good player. Put Decay on his peak with a championship team like this, and he could put in some serious work. Honestly, now that I'm looking at it, it may not even hurt to add Doha into the mix as well, just to have that extra Sombra coverage, but in general, I think this trio should be fine. Sparkle, while not great recently, did have an incredible peak during his early years with the Dallas Fuel, and of course his rookie season on the Paris Eternal. Edison had a great peak for the Fuel just a couple seasons ago. In the playoffs, he was absolutely insane. And also, while it may be weird to only have Fielder Chio for their support line after I added Iris for Atlanta, I think just because Dallas have shown us they can make it work with this team, that I can get away with only rolling with Fielder Chio and still have good success. And then Tank, it's Fearless Hanbin. 2 of the greatest of all time. It's just a really sick roster. For the defending champion Florida Mayhem, I have someone Gargoyle for the tank line. For DPS, Checkmate, Merit, and Yaki. Yaki's basically only here because he was iconic and his peak on Florida was really good. MVP form. And then for the back line, I'm just going with RuPaul and Chorong. I think that's all you really need. They showed us they can get away with running the double flex stuff. Chorong is a very reliable piece to have on the team. Him and RuPaul go really well together. And the rest of the stuff, I mean, they just won a championship together, right? It's really no explanation required. Someone, unironically, you could have as the only tank on the team, and you'll be absolutely fine. He's just so damn flexible. But again, in the result that you want this team in the 6v6 era, let's just include Gargoyle. At his peak, he was a pretty good off-tank. But yeah, pretty good team overall. Not many complaints. Lots of MVP level players. This Mayhem team is pretty good. The Guangzhou Charge. For their tanks, I'm going with Krong and Gaga. For the damage line, Choi Se-won, Happy, and Eileen to round it out off the bench. And for the back line, just Shu and Xerneas. You know, I can't decide if I love this team or if I hate it. Let's break it down. In terms of confidence, I'm really liking the DPS line. Choi Se-won Happy could do some serious damage. I'm a little worried because Choi Se-won, while good, has never really had the chance to prove himself at the highest level yet, but we can't really deny he has been really good the last 3 or so years. And Happy, he's coming off a great peak, and Eileen, while you'd probably have him off the bench and he's not the flashiest name, he still was an MVP candidate a couple of seasons ago in 2020. He was one of the leaders for the Charge, and he is a very flexible option, so it doesn't hurt to have him as another piece in case the meta goes haywire. For the backline, I mean, it's looking pretty decent. Shu Xerneas is a pretty solid combo. Xerneas has shown, again, like I said with Chengdu, that he can play flex support heroes, so I don't think there's need for another support player on the team. He's a good Brig player as well. Xerneas is a longtime veteran, and Shu, I mean, no explanation needed. At his peak, a lot of people will argue he's like maybe even the second best flex support of all time, so yeah, things are looking awesome there. The tank line is like the one place where I draw some concerns with this team. Krong Gaga is not very glorious. Krong at his peak was an excellent player. His Diva and his Sigma were great, but I don't really know how he'd hold up in the modern era. And Gaga, I mean, he's mostly there because there's not many other great options. You could pick Rio, who probably works better from a synergy standpoint, but Gaga is most definitely the more skilled player. And there's more heroes I trust him on, and I think he could be more of a playmaker, but also, again, not all that proven and not that amazing, so this Charge team is just okay. From one Chinese team to the other, the Hangzhou Spark, I'm going with Gushui Bernard, Shy Leave, Monk, Langsa, Teru. The Spark, I think, mostly would just play Gushui anyway, but obviously does have some weaknesses in his game. We've seen that both from the Overwatch League playoffs and the recent World Cup, where yes, he's a very, very good main tank player. He can play the dive heroes fantastic, he can even play the Orisa, but he's not much of an off-tank guy. Bernard can fill that role. He can play like Sigma, for example, and really boost what this Spark team is capable of. I think between the two of them, they could actually put up some really great performances and maybe end up being one of the more underrated tank lines. For the support line, I think that Monk Langsa proved themselves a lot this year. I think it goes without saying. I was just mentioning Monk before in the Chengdu part, just how amazing he looked in those really big tournament games against some amazing flex support players. He's definitely proved himself. He is a legendary player in the clutch, and even Langsa stepped up. For a long time, I was not on the Langsa bandwagon, but damn did he convert me with some of his recent performances. Recency bias or not, I think that is enough to put him on a Spark team that doesn't have a lot of great options for main support outside of IDK, but that was years ago, mostly in GOATs. So I feel pretty good about Monk Langsa, with Teru backing them up in the case of like a double flex support meta, and the damage line needs no introduction whatsoever. It's one of the greatest DPS lines ever assembled. Shy Leave are two of the greatest to ever do it, two of the best Chinese players ever as well. I mean, there is a situation where maybe you could have Alpha Yi on this team as well for like a heavy dive scenario. He had an excellent career himself, but I don't really see a world where you wouldn't be playing Shy Leave like 24/7, right? They're just too good of a duo. There's too much to pass up on by having one of these guys on the bench. We see what they can do together. They're legendary. They're the strong point of this team, and I think them alongside Gushui could do some crazy things together. The Houston Outlaws, I mean, thank God for this year, right? Their team would consist of Fearless Piggy on tank, Pelican Happy Dante on DPS, and support Shu and Violet. Overall, I like this Outlaws team a bunch. It's probably one of my favorites in this video. I don't know, I just feel like this Houston team is really flexible. I feel that no matter what the meta is, they're most likely to be very comfortable out there, which gives them a huge advantage. Also, it's a very balanced team. Every position has their carries, and they can all take over the game in an instant. Fearless is the greatest Winston player of all time. Any dive setup and you're all set, and in the situation where it becomes more slow-paced, or you need to rely on an off-tank hero, Piggy can be a seamless fit. Some people forget, just because of what you saw in Guangzhou, that Piggy on Houston was a menace, and that was arguably the best he ever was as a player. His Sigma, his Diva, his Zarya, all disgustingly good. He could cover Fearless's weakness and be a very strong contributor. And with that backline, forget about it, right? Shu, Violet plus Piggy and like a Sigma double flex support setup sounds absolutely ridiculous. Speaking of this backline, it's going to be one of the best out there. We saw what these two could do on Houston last year, but in general, it's just two of the greatest players ever, right? Two of the best support players in Overwatch League history on the same team. Shu and Violet both are very capable with their playmaking abilities on flex support, and in a moment's notice, Violet can go between both roles. He can be one of the best main supports or flex supports depending on your needs and the situation. It's just not fair. It's literally two GOATs. As for the damage line, I'd argue it's probably the least appealing part of the team, but definitely not a weakness. The one weird part for most people is going to be Dante. Feels like a strange fit, but he has to be here, right? It would be disrespectful to not have this Outlaws legend on this team. He contributed so much for them for the stretch of what, like 4 years? Dante's a very important part of the Houston Outlaws history, and he's one of their better players. He's just a good flex option to have as well, though. For starters, in the event that you're back on the Tracer Sombra setup, maybe you could throw him in over Pelican. Or, hell, you could even throw him on Doomfist if you wanted to. There's a lot that he could do. Or you could just have him sit there in spirit and be on the bench. I'm fine with that. Pelican, Happy, they're already a well-proven duo. We know what they're capable of based off of 2023. There's nowhere to go but up. Happy was playing the best Overwatch of his career on Houston, and Pelican's Pelican, so I like the Outlaws a lot. This is a very dangerous team. Now for where I'm going to draw some controversy. The London Spitfire. For them, I'm rocking with Gesture Fury, Prophet Birdring, then Landon Admiral Badoshan to round it out. The thing everybody's going to be looking at is Gesture. I get it, he's had some pretty poor years in the Overwatch League, very unimpressive stuff, also not a good Reinhardt either for that matter. But the fact is, he's just more proven than Hottie. He's more accomplished than him. He has a higher peak than Hottie as well. Gesture won a championship with London in Season 1, and he went to another Grand Finals entirely in Season 3 on the Dynasty, and in general, when he's needed to perform, a lot of the time he has. And he just offers more coverage than somebody like Hottie. Why force limitations? You're not in a situation like London in real life, where you are limited in what you can play, so why force it on the team, right? Play Gesture, who, while isn't the greatest Rhine, makes up for it for being a better Winston, an Orisa player, and, even a good Sigma if you want him to, and I just think that makes more sense. Maybe that's going to upset some people because Hottie is a crowd favorite, but I think Gesture offers you more as a player overall. As for the rest of the team, you have a good core with Fury, Prophet, and Birdring. All three of these guys were key contributors on London's first championship victory. And also, they're all-time greats at their respective positions. Fury, he's kind of fallen down with his stocks in recent years, but at his best, we know that he can compete at the top level. No doubts there based off of the last handful of years. Prophet Birdring's one of the greatest DPS lines ever assembled. These two at their peak is just not even fair, so very confident in those two. And then things get a little weird again at the backline. The tank and backlines are both not the best, but this is what I came up with. I think that Landon Admiral is probably the best backline you can have for London. I think Landon's a better player than Badoshan personally. Maybe that's a hot take, but I've loved what I've seen from him the last 2 years. Just a really strong, reliable BAP player, and I think on a good team like this, he could shine in other roles as well. And you pair them up next to Admiral. These two peaked together, I think it's a good idea to keep them together. And even though I don't have him starting, Badoshan can still be on the team, off the bench, as a rotation piece, double flex support meta, and in the instance where Admiral has to play things that aren't Lucio, maybe you sub him out in favor of Badoshan and you find more success. I could totally see it. Overall, though, it's a pretty big weak point of this London team. Not a very glamorous backline, not a lot of huge names, and that's sadly because London just don't have a very rich history at the position, so that's what we're going with. Fun team overall, but I don't know how they'd actually do. The LA Gladiators. Oh boy, this team is super scary. I'm going with a Fissure Void Reiner tank line, DPS will be Birdring, Kevster, and Decay, and the backline is Shu, Moth, and Skewed. I love this team from top to bottom, but let me address the weird thing going on at tank. Why do I have Fissure and Reiner? Well, in my opinion, Fissure would be the starter on this team. I think he's the better player, with the better overall peak. At his best, he was literally the best main tank player in the game, and I think if he was properly motivated, he could do something similar in the modern era. But I also have Reiner on here because there's going to be a lot of people in the comments who say, ooh, Fissure played with plumbers. That guy wouldn't survive in the modern era. Well, fine. You can have Reiner then. If that's what you want, you can do him. The rest of the team, though, very, very straightforward. Void is one of the best off-tank players of all time, and while his peak came on the Shanghai Dragons, if you put peak Shanghai Void on this Glad's team, it's going to be absolutely ridiculous. With the damage line, Birdring is Birdring, Decay is Decay, and then you have Kevster, another all-time great. That's a super solid and deadly DPS trio, and the same can be said for the backline. Shu, one of the best flex support players of all time. Moth, in a lot of people's eyes, still the best main support player of all time. And then you have Skewed to top it all off for the Brig metas and the double flex alongside his boy Shu. This team is disgusting, man. Tank may be a little worrisome in some situations, but I think overall this Glad's team could probably compete with most, if not all, other all-time rosters. You know who I can't say the same for, though? Their LA rivals, the Valiant. I'm going with Fate, Space, Kai, Agility, Shax, Becky, then Izayaki, Rain, Kariv to round it out. The Valiant have a giant roster, and it's gonna seem really weird, maybe even extreme, but the fact of the matter is, the Valiant need all of these players to address all of the specific needs on their team. That way they at least have a fighting chance in metas that most other teams could play in their sleep. As much as it hurts to say this as a former Valiant fan, this team is one of the worst out there, if not the worst. It starts off pretty good. I mean, Fate in Space is a perfectly fine tank line. Fate in the Overwatch 2 era maybe leaves a bit to be desired, but at his peak, we know he's a great playmaker. He can set up his teammates very well. And Space, I mean, he's arguably the greatest Western tank player ever. So that's really cool, and things even continue to be strong at support at the start, with Izayaki, an all-time great at his position. That's a pretty good trio right there. But the rest of the team, it's just like, eh. I'll give Kai a lot of credit. He was at his peak one of the top hit scans in the game, but that's mostly all he can provide, is hit scan and sniping ability, so he'll be solid in that regard and give the team a boost, but in a situation where we're more so in like a brawl meta or in a dive meta, he'll be useless, and that's where the other players come in to try and make up for it, and they don't even do that good of a job. Like, you have Agilities there to play your Genji and your Pharah, something the other guys can't really do, and for dive situations, you can play Shax and Becky on Tracer and Sombra respectively. Shax has a pretty good Reaper too, Becky can play Echo and like a little bit of Mei, but it's just nothing special. The Valiant have never really boasted a lot of top names at DPS outside of Kai. Things, I suppose, get a little bit better on support, but it's not exactly amazing. I like Izayaki, of course, but Rain and Kariv are just okay, right? I've changed my tune since the last all-time video, where I said Custa's leadership is maybe a bit more valuable than what Rain can do, but I've changed my mind since then. I realized that Rain just has more individual skill for this team. He's a pretty good Lucio and Brig at his peak on the 2020 Valiant, so maybe he could be okay. Nothing to write home about, but maybe serviceable. And then Kariv, I think, off the bench isn't a terrible idea. Him and Izayaki could do decently in like a double flex meta. Kariv, unfortunately, is a bit overrated, but at his peak, still a pretty good Ana player, so I guess you could have him off the bench. Overall, though, I just don't know what else you could do to fix this team. Like, you want to throw Seeker in there? I mean, I guess you could, but I don't know how much better it's going to make the team. The Valiant are just not glamorous at all, and they're lacking in so many places, so that's where I'm going to leave things. They kind of suck, but I think that's very fitting for a franchise that has mostly sucked. Anyway, moving on to the NYXL, you gotta go with the classics. Mono and Meko, Libero and SBB can be here as well. Jonek and Animo, they've got to be here, but I'm also going to add in some new faces along with the old core. I'm going to have Fitz join the DPS rotation and Creative on the support line. I think this team has some pretty decent coverage going on. Mono and Meko at their peaks were two of the most reliable tank players in the game. I think while Meko maybe fell off a bit towards the end of his career, is still a really good player overall. He can play most of the off tanks at the level you're looking for. Mono to this day is still regarded as one of the best tank players ever. I don't know how we do in the Overwatch 2 era, but I trust him. SBB, no need to explain that. All-time great Tracer player, good hit scan as well, pretty underrated on that role. And in the result that you don't think that he's good enough on hit scan, I think you can just play Fitz instead. Some people might be sad that there's no Pine. Maybe you could have him in Spirit, I guess, but Fitz just has some very high peaks. He has the consistency as well, a much longer career, more proven, so I think Fitz just makes more sense than somebody like Pine from like a pure hit scan perspective, and not just thinking about nostalgia. The other thing some people might be upset about is that there's no Hangzhou, but I have Libero. But to be honest with you, Libero I think just offers you more as a player from a flexibility standpoint. Hangzhou has the higher peak, yes, but Libero can play more heroes, which is what you're looking for. Libero has always been a really solid player, very underrated, a really good Genji himself, even though Hangzhou is better. He's a good Mei player. He can move on to hitscan as well. He can play Pharah. He can play Echo. Libero's just a jack of all trades, and I think he's a good way to round out the DPS line. Support is also kind of strong. Jonak at his best, one of the best flex supports to ever do it. Godlike Zenyatta player. He can play the Ana as well. But also, you have creative there, as there's some things that Jonak maybe isn't the best at that he's shown throughout his career, and creative can make up for those weaknesses. The last couple of years, he's been a solid all-around flex support player who's played at a high level no matter what the hero is. So I think him and Jonak combined could actually lead to some very successful results at the flex support role. This New York team is vintage, but also have some fun other twist in it, and I like it. Time for the San Francisco Shock, the league's one and only dynasty. For this team, I have Smurf, Choi Hyobin, and Super on tank. DPS will be Proper, Ant, Rascal, and Striker. In the backline is, of course, Violet, Moth, and Twilight. There's a couple of weird things on this team, and maybe some things seem a bit unnecessary, so let me walk you through my thoughts. I think that Smurf Choi is basically all you really need for the tank line. Smurf is just an all-time great tank player who can play just about anything, and Choi, I mean, still to this day, maybe arguably the best off-tank of all time, so you're pretty set there. But, I don't know, I feel like people would be mad at me if I didn't have Super on this team. He probably wouldn't play that much outside of Rhine, but hey, he should at least be there in spirit, right? He's a pretty crucial part of the Shock. Support also may seem a bit overloaded, but I think it's a very balanced attack that you can do. The Shock like to have a lot of DPS, we've seen that throughout the years, and I think this would fit Krusty's system a lot. Proper being added to this legendary bunch would be absolutely absurd. He literally can be the best player ever with the right support around him. Proper at his peak is going to do some nasty stuff with this team. But then he's not going to be able to do it all, so you give him a good mix of other things to help with the coverage. If you need another heavy sniper in there, Ant is the way to go. Maybe the most dominant Widowmaker player of all time, if not like top tier. Or if you're really needing someone who can play the niche stuff, if you need that extra flexibility, like with Mei or with Echo, for example, Rascal's a really good fit. Just a jack of all trades player that doesn't hurt to have on your team. And Striker, while maybe a bit weirder of a fit, makes sense in the situation where you need to have a hit scan, but also a tracer. Like if you want Proper in the game to play Sojourn, but you also need a tracer player, Striker's a good fit. One of the best tracers to ever do it. I think it makes at least a little bit of sense to have him on there as like a reassurance plan. And then you round things out with even more consistency. You have good tanks, and then you have good support sandwiched in between this DPS line. Violet, Moth, and Twilight is absolutely absurd. We've known that for years now. Violet's the best to ever do it, arguably. The GOAT. Twilight, another GOAT at flex support, can make up for the Ana weakness of the team. Violet and Twilight together, and the Bap Zen setup is absurd. And then you have Moth there, the heart and soul of the team, the in-game leader, the Lucio player. It's just a great all-around combo, and one of the best teams without a shadow of a doubt. The Seoul Dynasty. I think a good team could be Smurf Void a tank, Prophet, Fitz, and Fleta for the damage. In the backline will be Creative, Toby, and Ryo Jae-hong. I mean, wow, talk about stacked. A lot of all-time greats, especially in that tank and DPS department. Smurf and Void is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, what could these guys not do together in their primes? I love this Dynasty tank line. It might be my favorite of the entire video. And I mean, oh boy, Prophet, Fitz, Fleta, that's a scary trio trio right there. Prophet and Fitz, we've already seen what they can do throughout the years, but then you're adding in Fleta, even more flexibility, another all-time great, a former MVP candidate. What could these guys not do together? The only place that maybe isn't god tier is the backline, but I still like it a lot. Creative, for example, I think he could be a reliable starter on this Dynasty team. Take the peak version of himself on NYXL and put him back in with his buddies and watch him thrive. He could hold up with some of the better all-time flex supports out there. I truly do believe that, especially now that he's not just an Ana player. He can play so many other things at the level you're looking for. And alongside him, you have Toby, one of the more underrated main support players out there still, I feel. An all-time great. In some people's eyes, maybe even top 5 ever. He's shown through his peaks, like on 2020 Dynasty, that he can play a lot of different things. He's one of the best Lucio players ever. He can play Break, he can play Mercy, even BAP if needed. Toby's a good all-around leader, and just a consistent player that does not ever hurt to have on your team. And with the third option, a lot of people will say it should just straight up be Jonak, which I understand, but in my opinion, he does not count. While he signed with the Dynasty, technically he was gone before the season even started, so I'm just going to call that a technicality, and instead go with the more iconic Ryu Jae-hong, who didn't really hold up in the modern era, but I think if you take a peak version of himself from like 2018, 2019 with peak motivation, that he could be a very valuable contributor to the Dynasty, even if he just comes off the bench. For their inner city rivals, the Seoul Infernals / Philly Fusion, I have a Mono Fury tank line, Carpe Zest MN3 DPS trio, and an Alarm Funny Astro skewed support rotation. I also think you could put Poco and EQO mostly on for the lulz, but they'd mostly just be off the bench. They wouldn't really play. It's just them in spirit, really, just because they were pretty important to the Philly Fusion's history. Addressing the main aspects of the roster, though, I think it's pretty nice. Mono Fury, they're more so old-timers at this point, but at their peak, pretty deadly players, both extremely consistent, neither too aggressive by any means, both valuable contributors on a game-to-game basis. Mono Fury give you a pretty good balance that you're looking for a tank, even though the carry potential may not always be there. The DPS line, I mean, we've seen it function before. It was with Carpe at like the end of his era and losing motivation, but him, Zest, and MM3 can coexist, and if you put a prime Carpe on this team, it could make one hell of a difference. A lot of people give Carpe crap, but he's one of my all-time favorite players, and he is without a doubt one of the best players to ever play for that franchise. He's had so many great years full of success, and when he is in the zone, he can carry everybody on that team to a victory. He knows how to will a team to that win, and I think that's a very important quality that you don't want to miss out on, even if he just comes off the bench. And realistically, there is a chance where he comes off the bench just because of MN3's abilities on a pure hit scan role, and the fact that Zest has been one of the best flex DPS in the league for the better part of 2 years. Generally though, I don't really see a lot of issues with this DPS line. It's not perfect, they have their fair share of flaws, but they're going to hold up against a lot of DPS lines. But where the real strength with this team comes in is that back line. Alarm, Funny Astro, and Skewed is freaking OP, man. We've talked about how good Skewed was with Shu, but just imagine him with Alarm, God rest his soul. Oh my goodness gracious. Those two in like a Zen BAP setup, a Zen Brig, an Ana Brig, holy moly, that could actually be world breaking. And just to top it off, you have, just a casual world-class Lucio player in Funny Astro, and someone who synergizes with Alarm so well. This Fusion support line is going to carry, and they're going to keep them in a ton of games. I think this team would be solid. Definitely not top tier, but I think that they could actually pull off a fair share of upsets thanks to the carry potential of their DPS and supports. As for the Shanghai Dragons, I mean, it's mostly just the players you know, right? The one weird thing with them is going to be that tank line. I have Fate, Fearless, and Void. I don't know, it just feels weird to not include either Fate or Fearless. It's kind of lopsided to have them both on this team, but not including one of them when they've both made some valuable contributions in different ways just doesn't sound right to me. Fate is like the guy that sets up his teammates, really good Wrecking Ball player at his peak, really good Orisa as well, but Fearless brings that carry potential on Winston at the same time, and I don't think you want to miss out on that. Like, just willingly passing up on Fearless sounds like a terrible idea. I say screw it, why not have all three of them, because they're not going to have a very big lineup anyway. Have Fate, Fearless, and Void at tank, 3 very consistent contributors, and then with DPS, Fleta and Lip, they won a championship together. 2 amazing players, even if Lip recently has had some chokes happen. And then Who Are You can round it out just to play Genji. We've seen how dominant he can be in a Genji meta, and Fleta happens to not be the best on that hero, so just for some extra reassurance, we can have Who Are You for that one random one-off Genji meta. For support, maybe you could also include a flex support player of some sort. I mean, pick your poison. You want to go with like Gangnam Jin or Molly or Luffy. You can pick which one you want. But generally, Lee Jae-gun Izayaki has gotten the job done over the years, and I trust them to do so in this situation as well. At their peak on this peak Dragons team, I think they'll do alright, and this team would probably do very, very well for themselves. Probably top tier. Did you enjoy all the top tier stuff? Well, I hope you did, because now we're moving on to more of the bottom of the barrel. The Toronto Defiant, a team with a very sad and mid history. For this team, on tank, I have Kaluj and, I can't believe I'm saying this, Sato. On DPS, Hisu, Spectra, and Hydron. In the backline will be Twilight, Chorong, and Ultraviolet. Yeah, Sato is very weird and probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but he's like one of the only main tank options Toronto Defiant have. Like, Kaluj in a single tank setup isn't the worst in the world, but there's some things he's just not that great on. Like, he's a good off-tank player and a good Orisa player, but why not upgrade like what you can do on Winston and Ryan, for example, you know? Even Wrecking Ball. I'm not saying it's a massive upgrade. I mean, Sato at his peak was good, but was carried by a really strong backline, and other than that, hasn't really done much in his career, but it's still better than like any other choice you could make for another tank on Defiant. So I'll just go with Sato, and then you have Kaluj there to take care of the rest. Very reliable player, but again, also not really top tier. DPS and support really aren't that bad, though. I mean, Hisu, Spectra, Hydron, I think that works well. Hisu carried this sorry Toronto team for years. Good Sombra and hit scan. Hydron's a nasty hit scan. You have Spectra there for Tracer, and for Mei and all of your typical flex DPS needs. You're looking good there. And the backline, that's probably the strongest part of the team. Twilight and Chorong are 2 all-time greats at their respective positions, and then you have Ultraviolet there to back them up. I think that having UV on this team is a pretty cool idea. Even if he doesn't get that much playtime, I just like him a lot, and I think he should be on the roster, just as some reassurance. Overall, though, I mean, there's just not that much to look forward to on this Defiant team. Like, it's a cool team, but it probably wouldn't function all that well. They have a lot of random strengths and weaknesses, and they would not hold up. But how about their Canadian counterparts, the Vancouver Titans? Are they any better? Well, in my opinion, maybe a little bit. For tanks, I decided to pick Fissure and Punk. For the DPS line, they'll have Sugar-Free, Shockwave, and Hoxel. And for the backline, it will be Twilight, Masa, and Crimzo. It's kind of crazy how Twilight ends up on both Canada teams, and just 4 teams overall in this video. Good for him. But there are some weird things about this team I've got to explain, so let's get right into it. Starting with support, you may say it's kind of weird to not have Slime here, but I think he's just not flexible enough to get the job done. This ain't GOATS. Let's get the facts right. He's not just going to be having to play Lucio, and based off of what we've seen, he can't really play anything else, so I wouldn't feel that confident in Slime, even though he has the synergy with Twilight. So instead, we'll go with a more reliable veteran like Masa, who's helped lead a team to a Grand Finals appearance, and has had multiple successful seasons at the Overwatch League level. He is more so known for his Lucio, just like with Slime, but he's shown the ability to play well on other things and adapt and just be that leader and shot caller that can help put a team on the map. And you know, we'll throw Crimzo in there as a third option for the double flex support situations. He mostly would be on the bench because of a legend like Twilight, but in an emergency scenario, in a pinch, I think that Crimzo is a great substitute to have. He has proven himself throughout the years. He's consistent, he's underrated, and he can make some good contributions. With tank, I'm not going with Bumper because that guy's a feeder. He got carried by his backline. I will not hear otherwise. Fissure is a smarter, more reliable player and arguably a better playmaker at his peak. With off-tank, I went with Punk over Janu, which may seem very, very strange, considering I have been a Janu fanboy throughout the years, but good as he was, he did have a very short-lived prime. It mostly came on D.Va and Roadhog. The Roadhog thing was very cheesy, and it's just not something that would work in the modern day. D.Va isn't as good right now. His Sigma was never that great. His Zarya was never that great. And Punk overall, throughout his career, has been consistent since the very start. He has more good years under his belt than Janu, even though Janu absolutely has the higher peak. I mostly saw Janu succeed in GOATs, but I've seen Punk succeed in a lot of different places, so I think from a flexibility standpoint and guaranteed value, he's just a bit better. And lastly, I'm going with Shockwave over somebody like Stitch, or he who should not be named. I think that Stitch is kind of in a similar situation to Janu, just a very short-lived prime, not very impressive overall in his career, but he had those moments in the playoffs with the Justice on Ashe and just not much aside from that. Shockwave's had a couple of good years in the league now. I'm confident that on a good team, he could carry. Maybe not to the extent that you're looking for to win a title, but he could be serviceable, right? And I think alongside Hoxel and Sugarfree, it could be a good combination. Somebody like Hoxel was definitely a must-have, right? He won Rookie of the Year on Vancouver, and to this day is still considered to be one of the all-time greats on Flex DPS. And then just to round it out, you have Sugarfree, a guy who showed on Vancouver this year that he can be the guy that bridges everything together. That guy that can reliably play whatever the team needs so they can always be as comfortable as humanly possible. I like what he showed me on Vancouver, and I think in an all-time setup, he could do much of the same in his prime. You could have him play the Tracer, or the Sombra, the Genji if Hoxel's not in the game, Echo. There is a lot that Sugarfree provides, and he's a great way to round out a pretty decent looking damage line. I don't love this Vancouver team, but they have a cool mix of awesome players from a lot of different eras, and I think they'd be pretty fun to watch. Speaking of fun to watch, next is the Vegas Eternal, who are basically mostly just the 2020 team with a couple of exceptions. I went with Hanbin, Benbest, Sparkle, Exy, Knife, Fielder, FD God, and Rack Attack. This Eternal team has a good 4-man core. Hanbin, Sparkle, Exy, and Fielder did a lot of work back in the day for the Eternal, and now if you put them all in their peaks on this Eternal team, they're going to do even more together. Since that 2020 Paris run together, all of these guys have developed with the exception of Exy, but if you take 2020 Exy and just put them on this team, they're going to do great. But where things get a little weird is with the other stuff, but unfortunately there's not a lot of other choices for the Eternal as they don't exactly have a rich history full of amazing talent. Somebody's got to play Winston in the main tank stuff, and Benbest is basically the best Eternal have, unless you'd rather have, like, Don, I guess. But Benbest had an okay peak on 2020 Eternal, which is why I went with him. He can't really play Winston the best either, but again, what other choices do you really have out there? Then for somebody like Knife, he's a weird fit, and he probably wouldn't play that much, but he showed us that if he had the right team around him, he could probably be one of the next big things with how crazy he was going on the Tracer. So I think just having him as like a young developmental option off the bench wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. And when it comes to the support line, at least with FD God, it's the same thing that I said about Benbest. Yeah, FD's had a lot of unimpressive years, but there's not a lot of other great main support options out there for the Vegas Eternal. Maybe you want to go with like Dredro instead, but I think FD got at the higher peak. On 2020 Eternal, he was like a top 4 main support in the league, arguably. His Lucio is absolutely insane at its best, and back then he could at least play a little bit of Brig. So if you take the best version of himself and put him on this team, maybe he could at least kind of hold up. And just to round the team out with some fun, I went with Rack Attack. Rack Attack deserves to be on a team that has a better chance to win, a more skilled team, but also maybe he'll make for a better balance alongside Fielder if FD God gets too aggressive, or if he can't really play Brig that well, you could put Rack in there and maybe he does a better job. But still, overall, there's going to be more good starters in the game than mediocre, so Vegas could actually be surprisingly competitive. Just with Hanbin, Sparkle, Exy, and Fielder, that might be enough to win them a decent bit of games. And lastly, to finish up the video, the Washington Justice. Not the most impressive team in the world, but here's what I came up with. At tank, Mag and Fury. DPS, Decay, Happy, and Alpha Yi, with honorable mentions to the legendary Corey. And on support, I have Vigilante, FD God, and Krillin. The Justice are very strange. That backline is gonna kill them big time. The Justice sadly have one of the worst backline histories in the league. What other choices are there? Teru, closer, Bebe, opener? Yeah, this is basically the best they can do, and I really don't know how they'd perform. A peak FD God could maybe do okay. Krillin is relatively stable, and he could play main or flex support depending on the needs, but he's not exactly an amazing player. And Vigilante is mostly here for potential reasons. He played only a handful of games in his Overwatch League career. We know that he's extremely talented, but it hasn't really resulted in that much. He looked okay in like the 4 games he played for Washington, and that might actually be the best they've ever had, which is extremely sad. But yeah, a lot of the heavy lifting is going to come up front and with the damage dealers. Mag Fury, I think, is a pretty decent tank line. Not amazing, but definitely not the worst either. Mag is coming off the peak of his career on the Seoul Infernal last year. He's shown he can be reliable on a variety of tank characters, which is very useful. And Fury's Fury, so not too shabby there. But then there's the DPS, the real strong point of this team. Decay and Happy are both coming off arguably the biggest peaks of their career. Honestly, Alpha Yi as well. It's just 3 players who are in their primes right now that we've seen a lot from that can carry a team. They have a little bit of everything here. Good Tracer play, really good Genji and Echo play. They have their hit scan master. They can play Sombra. This DPS line could really surprise some people. But generally, because they're just okay at like tank and support, they just might be more towards bottom of the barrel. Not the worst team, one that I don't necessarily hate, but from an all-time standpoint, I don't know how they're going to hold up. And on that note, that's going to do it. That is what my all-time lineup / rotation would be for all 20 Overwatch League franchises. What are your thoughts on this kind of video? Did you enjoy it? And what would you have changed for specific teams, if anything? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you want more Overwatch League content and other Overwatch esports videos in the future, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you're new. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.